Hello. So let's see. Gotta make sure I'm recording this. Recording in progress. And one, two, three. Yep, you can hear me. Now I'm gonna try and share content. This is lecture on Psycho Take Two. I rambled on a bit last night. Right now it's Saturday around 4:45. And but I didn't put the audio on somehow, so there were scenes. I deleted the tape because it wound up being confusing. I didn't realize I needed to make sure the audio was up and running on this portion of uh, of what for the BB Collaborate before I shared the application. So while I have your eyes on me, I'll just put something very obvious, but the kind of the part of the theme of my lecture here is going to be the relationship of the I, as in I am, to the I, as in the eyeball. So there is, uh, when without others, there's no way to really construct a feeling of I, which is really how we refer to ourself. So when you are referring to yourself, you are not that self you're referring to. And when you are being that self without referencing it, then you're not the I that that self corresponds to. Or to put that another way, when you speak, you are spoken. And when you feel spoken, you speak. But speaking and being spoken can never be the same. So the uneasiness, the constant, what Freud called the ego, trying to manage the symbolic, the imaginary, the real, and the symptom, and then the ego is the executive function, and it's in the center of that overlap. It's a constant process, and we try and stabilize it by referring to our ego as I, but it's artificial. The ego never stops moving. It never stops feeling pressure from one minute from the real, the next from the imaginary, then from the symbolic, then from the symptom, all in different to different degrees. And in fact, Hollywood cinematic genres, and we've done romance so far, and now we're moving to horror. Another way to understand them is they're all about modernity and about the pressures of trying to live in modernity, what modernity feels like. And the hallmark of modernity is there's no agreed upon belief in a transcendence, whether that be a god or a godot. So we're drowning in immanence. Everything, it's an eternal present, and we have to somehow construct a past, and we have to somehow construct an idea of a future, but we're always relentlessly getting woven and unwoven, knotted and unknotted. I mean, think the ego is like a knot. If you put in a knot in string, this is a rubber band, but if I put a knot, uh, see this, and so I put a knot in this rubber band. Okay, so now this knot, you can see that. So this is your ego, but the knot doesn't exist. The knot is just an arrangement of what was already there before there was a knot. And so romance tries to tie the knot, pardon the pun. Horror makes it constantly clear that that knot could become unknotted. And then you're lost, you're terrified. The horror of horror is the knot unknots. And as it will in Psycho, because Norman Bates, as a child, had a sort of tentative knot, like so, and like anyone growing up, the love of his mother, the father's hardly mentioned, maybe disappeared before he was born. It's a tentative knot, but the mother was narcissistic, and one gets the feeling that based on what happens to Norman Bates, that she could never see him as as separate from her. And of course, he was separate from her, but nothing about her gave him that impression. Now, normally, that kind of narcissistic parent can be the damage, if you will, can be alleviated because there are other family members, but there's no father and there are no siblings. There doesn't even seem to be. He doesn't have friends. He must have gone to school, but he doesn't bring it up. He's lived with his mother in this hotel where they moved the road, so it never even gets guests unless people are lost, like Marion Crane will be. And so he, like all of us, how we see. So the eye has an eye, but how this eye is constructed, it inflects how this eye sees. And Hitchcock is a genius at this. So you also have to ask yourself in a Hitchcock film and in many other good films, what's happening with the gaze? Who's looking? Who's being looked at? Who's being looked at and doesn't know it? Who thinks they're looking at someone who doesn't know it and doesn't know that someone's looking at them and they don't know it? That's the plot of Vertigo, which we'll be doing at the end of A11. If you've had A11 already, or if you're currently in it, you can look forward to that. And the other thing that inflects what the eye can see is the desire, is the symbolic, real, imaginary symptom of the eye, which is constantly a kaleidoscope that's constantly changing. And just like a kaleidoscope changes shapes, even though it remains a kaleidoscope, your ego is a kaleidoscope, and what comes through your eye into the kaleidoscope of your eye is also constantly changing. And yet we try and stabilize this eye so that we can stabilize the gaze from this eye. And so cinema, more than any other art form, has an amazing capacity to manipulate through editing the relationship of one's eye to what one sees. And we can play with this endlessly. And you have the camera is a kind of an eye. And we who have an eye are dependent on the eye of the camera for what we see. So as spectators of the film, we have a stable eye. Romance tries to shore up the ego by finding your perfect complement. So a benevolent gaze. Notice how Edward and Vivian, one of the primary things they do for each other has nothing to do with physical attraction, is each confirms to the other that they're worth more than their parent figure allowed them. So Edward has father issues. He doesn't, his mother, he only brings up his mother as someone he felt sorry for because the mother got abandoned by the father, as did he. And so the abandonment of the father made him feel potentially worthless, and made him angry that his mother had been victimized. And so his way out of that was to become a venture capitalist and actually eventually buy out his father and break up his father's corporations. The problem with that is that it makes sense in a way. You can fight back against the gaze that tells you you're not worthwhile. But if you're not careful, that becomes your life. Your life becomes, I mean, you can do this, but then the symptom is the dominant mover in your ego. You're constantly trying to manage the symptom. And we're in a culture that's rampant with addiction, alcoholism, drugs, pornography, sex, gambling, retail, going to Holt Renfrew, looking up houses on Zillow. I don't know if you saw the very funny skit on Saturday Night Live where they show me these real estate commercials, but they do it in the genre of the late night phone sex ads. So it's like, do you need something special? Do you need to have a secret? And they show you like a $5 million mansion where you can click through the pictures, and they're presented as kind of porn or naughty pictures, but it's just like a living room and a staircase. It's really good. I think I'll try and see if I can see if it goes to YouTube, or if any of you find it, send it to me, leonardgary@hotmail.com. I can do a lot with that clip. I'm teaching a class, literature, the body, literature and film, next year. Also teaching the second half of this course while I'm on the subject, which will be 3 more genres: film noir, the Western, and melodrama. And it's clearly a companion course, but the order in which you take the 2 courses doesn't really matter. And I sort of incorporate introductory film studies into both of them. So if you only take one, or if your friends, want to take this second one, they're not at a disadvantage because they're not in this one, although you probably could help them get a running start. So that's all an aside, and I think I might be doing one other class. I can't think of it. So I'll let you know. Where was I? Okay. So the I, that's keep that in mind no matter what I say, and as we're going forward. And so this gets us into a part of that was very evident in Eternal Sunshine, and that is the way that cinema suppresses its own apparatus. In other words, at least avant-garde cinema, so-called, tends to be cinema that draws attention to the fact that it is cinema. So it kind of keeps breaking down the illusion in various interesting ways. Certainly, mainstream Hollywood ostensibly does not, but certainly Hitchcock all his movies are also about movies to varying degrees. So it's about the experience of going to movies. It's about what it means to look, what it means to be looked at, and how the gaze, and being either the master gaze or being subject to the gaze of the master, has an effect on this kaleidoscopic formation of the self/ego and the way that it turns. So what you see is not what needed to be seen, or is just, we have this sense of sight as we see what's there. Nothing could be farther from the truth. We see something there, but that's not what is there. What is there is us. The is of that is our being determines what we notice. So you and I can both look at the same living room, and then we retire to a separate room, and someone says, write 200-word description of that room. And that wouldn't be the same description. I mean, there are bound to be some overlap, but I might notice a few things you didn't. You might notice a few things I didn't. And the tone in which we report on what we saw would also reveal the different inflections of desire that are kind of invisible pressure on our sense of being. So the suspense that Hitchcock is famous for is he's constantly creating tension between the I and the I, so that characters in the movies think that they know that what they see is all there is to see, or all that's important to see. They don't realize the extent to which the internalized gazes in there are directing their sight, and that's exactly what a director does. A cinema director is, at least for the duration of the movie, you invite the director inside your head as your internal gaze. Now, Hitchcock didn't raise you; he wasn't your dad, so you're not going to leave the theater with that internalized gaze. But for the duration of the movie, you're dependent on Hitchcock's editing decisions, and he'll make those decisions as in a way that seems in line with you being the viewer of the film, being in control. But most of the time he only does that to set you up so that when you're feeling in control as a viewer of the film, he will undercut that, and then he'll do the same thing to the characters that are in the film. But it creates this bizarre sense when you're watching Hitchcock that you're in the film. You're with Marion Crane when she goes to the Bates Motel. You're as unaware as she is that Norman Bates is dangerously imbalanced. You think he has a living mother who lives in the house on top of the hill. When Marion arrives, she looks up and sees a silhouette of an old woman, and then she honks the horn because it's raining and she wants to get to the hotel for the night, and a young man comes clambering down the steps. So it's a logical conclusion that that was the young man's mother, and that's how film works. But at the same time, Hitchcock is not telling you that film can create an illusion of continuity. For instance, you show a picture of a man looking up, and you show a picture of the Eiffel Tower, and the viewer is going to say, oh, this guy's in Paris. But it doesn't have to be. Montage is always illusory. We don't know what's the effect of montage is created in between two shots. So a shot of a man looking up doesn't suggest he's in Paris, and a shot of the Eiffel Tower doesn't suggest there's someone in Paris. But if you do the one shot followed by the second shot, and it seems to be a subjective point of view shot, and that's what's key, like this is what this man we just saw is seeing, then we'll say, oh, he's in Paris. And in the early days of cinema, there was a Russian director, along with Eisenstein, who did experiments, and the cinema began as a scientific apparatus. In 1904, it was cinema that finally proved that there's a moment in a horse's gallop where all 4 feet are off the ground. There had been, but photography couldn't do it, and the naked eye, so-called, couldn't do it. And this was a discovery of such import. It was on the cover of Scientific American in 1904. So it was presumed that cinema would die out quite quickly as a novelty, as an entertainment novelty, and it would remain as a lab device. And I'm not saying it isn't a lab device, but the extent to which it became a new art form and a form of entertainment was astonishing. And nobody, including the Lumiere brothers, who virtually invented cinema, thought that it was going to have a very long half-life. I mean, they felt like they needed to get in and get out before the public grew bored, but that's because they didn't know how editing was going to develop. They didn't know what Griffith was going to do with it, and Hitchcock and Kubrick and these artists. The Lumiere brothers just had a static camera, and then they tried to point it at something interesting, like a train entering the station or people leaving a factory, and that was it. It's called cinema of attractions. They're 3 minutes long. You can find them on YouTube. They're kind of worth a look, but you can see why the Lumiere brothers weren't convinced that film was going to take over the world, because once you get over the idea of like, wow, that is so weird, this actually looks like a train entering a station, you're going to move on. And then his other thought was, well, and this worked for a little while, is we can take pictures of the streets of New York and Paris, and then people who are in Iowa or they'll be interested. They'll get to see what it's like if you were actually looking out a window in New York. And those had a certain vogue to an extent, but again, limited. It wasn't story, and it was spectator. It had a very, very simplistic. It put the viewer in a very one-dimensional, like you're looking out a window at New York. End of story. Nobody realized how powerful it was going to be to keep weaving this I in raveling and unraveling. And often when we're feeling suspense for a character, it's because we know something they don't. And so we have a master gaze. They don't realize they're being seen by something that they don't know exists. Like they think they know, as when Marion's sister goes up to the house to talk to this old lady, like how dangerous can an old lady be? She's trying to figure out what happened to her sister. And she's perfectly willing to be nice. And she's like, Mrs. Bates. And we're like, get the hell out of the house. By then we know that Mrs. Bates has been dead for 10 years. And there is no Mrs. Bates. There's only Norman Bates, who's homicidally unhinged and dresses up as his mother to murder either threats to his mother or perceived threats to him. Although really the main drama of Psycho is that Norman Bates was raised by a narcissistic mother incapable of loving him. So the gaze that he internalized was her constantly verbally abusing him. And in a way, it should be a clue, if we're paying attention, that if Norman Bates's mother is actually a separate person, why is it that the only thing she ever says to him is abusive? It makes more sense once we figure it out that he's giving her dialogue. You're so weak, and you're pathetic, and you're disgusting, and it just goes on, and that's all she ever says. And which makes sense if it's an internalized voice, which accompanies an internalized gaze. Then he doesn't give his mother any other lines of dialogue, because it's those times of abuse that formed him. She must have said other things to him in the time of growing up, but they were probably relatively indifferent. So the only two things he experienced from his mother was withering and rather gendered. I mean, she's really down on how pathetic a man he is, or how he's a boy who will never be a man. And it's hard to know what ran off the first father, but it seems like the stepfather was actually manipulating the mother. He says at one point, so this guy persuaded my mom to buy this hotel. He could have persuaded her to do anything. And what he's leaving out is that now he can't even pretend that his mother cares about him. She has her own internalized gaze, and now she's being dominated probably by pretty much a con artist. So now he's out of the picture. So he kills both of them. But when he kills his mother, there's no Norman Bates, because his entire life is based on trying to please his mother, trying to be her desire. And this movie really illustrates the degree to which our desire is to be the desire of the other. So when we want to be loved, we want to, certainly as a child and later to some extent, we want to be the desire of the other. I mean, there's a certain element in what romance tries to do is equalize this, so that it looks like each person has become what the other wants, but in fact, each has become the desire of the other. And it sounds kind of the same, but it's not, because that's why love can hurt so much, is that once you think you've become the desire of the other, when you meet someone later, that can make it feel like you've repaired any traumas from the past where you didn't feel like the desire of your mother or your father. So then when the breakup occurs, if it does, it's existentially threatening, because all of the trauma that the romance seemed to put to rest is coming back. And you may not expect it because it feels like it's gone away for good, but in fact, it's only been held in suspension because part of you has misinterpreted the gaze of your lover as reparation of whatever was lacking in the gaze of the parents or whatever caring figures who were responsible for your care, whether they were caring or not. There's nothing, it's very hurtful to have the person who's in the position of caring for you not care about you. I mean, you might get fed and you might be in a house, but it's existentially devastating to not be able to figure out, not be able to construct a fairly stable I. So Norman Bates has no I. His whole, and he sees through the eyes of his mother. Like, he doesn't see anything as Norman Bates. He's like one of those stuffed birds. They have eyes, and they have beady little eyes, and it looks like they're staring really hard, but they're dead and they're stuffed. And eventually, so is his mother. I mean, that's his desperate attempt to control her gaze, is to kill her, stuff her, and have her look at him. And it doesn't matter, because her voice and her gaze has already been internalized. It doesn't matter how dead she is, or stuffed, and then he tries to be her. And love himself, but of course, all he can do is be the her that he's internalized, which is this abusive person. And he grew up with just her. That point seems to be made. He had nothing else to work with, to get a different point of view. No lovers, certainly no teachers, no coaches, no religious figures, no church, club, nothing. And that's part of why he's so damaged. I mean, it would have been hard enough to grow up the way he did, but without pushback from other gazes, then the internalized gaze is so absolute that he is nothing except the hostility that his mother felt toward him, for not essentially solving the problems of the mother, such as they were. It's hard to tell. So that's my preamble. Now what I'm going to try and do this time, this better be audio because I'm so tired of talking to myself, is I'm going to share the screen. And why isn't it giving me the option? Okay, share application screen. I'm going to go to my Chrome tab and I'm going to share. Hello. Okay, I have to pick something. Okay, now I'm going to share. All right, so hopefully you still hear my voice. I wish you were there to tell me. And you'll see the Alfred Hitchcocks up on your screen right now. And I'm just going to go back to make sure that I can see me and I can See my little microphone bouncing up and down. All right, that's my voice. All right, so now I'm going to try. This is the opening, and we'll go through a few scenes. What I want you to notice about the soundtrack right away is what a dramatic contrast there is between the that famous violin shriek, and which then segues into this kind of long, somber, recomposing bum 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 bum, and then there's the other major musical motif is a, I would call it this the song of the ego. Na 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 na, and then it's like jintum jintum whoop whoop whoop. I can almost do the soundtrack, but so now what you're going to see is the credits. It's just soundtrack, and but notice that the credits, like this word Alfred Hitchcock, is going to fracture. So visually, you're going to watch the eye and the eye break up, and orally, in terms of your ear, you're also going to hear that what breaks it up is anytime the relationship of your eye to what you see, your ego to what you see, anytime that's disrupted in a way that in which you cannot make sense, then your eye, your ego fractures, and then you have to. It's very disorienting. It's what we call cognitive dissonance. Probably some of you psychologists know this, psychology majors. And culture, I mean, the whole point of cinematic genre is to also assuage the cultural dissonance, the cognitive dissonance of the culture. So as we talked about with The Graduate, when contraception comes in and premarital sex is no longer so linked to fear of pregnancy, that creates cultural dissonance. Like, what? So tell me again, why do women have to be virgins on their wedding night? Well, because they don't want to get pregnant. Yeah, but you don't get pregnant. There's a pill now. Oh, wait, there must be some other reason. And of course, this was before AIDS and before at least the rampant outbreak of STDs, but both syphilis and gonorrhea and chlamydia, while hardly anything anyone wanted to experience, they did respond and still do, although not as well, to penicillin because they're bacteria. But then AIDS came along, and while difficult to transmit and having a rather long gestation, was also essentially incurable. So that put a panic in. And then herpes came along on a lesser level in the sense that it didn't kill you, but it also didn't resolve, and was seen as well as a stigma, certainly, especially for women, as in most things sexual. Anyway, let's listen to the soundtrack. Let's see if this will work. So you want to pay attention to these lines. You get them in either vertical or horizontal. And the vertical lines seem to be this construction or attempt to construct a new order, and it seems to calm down the music. But inevitably you get these horizontal lines that start going across. This will also be the rhythm of the stabbing in the famous shower scene, where the knife will be going up and down. And the house where Norman Bates lived is built as a very horizontal structure. It has multiple levels, whereas the modern hotel is, did I say vertical? I meant vertical. Mix those up sometimes. The hotel is completely horizontal. It's just one cabin after another. There's no second level. So you have this sort of classic and the modern in the two major forms of architecture. So the house is kind of Victorian. It's full of hallways and stairways and cellars and secret rooms, and whereas the cabins, of course, are sterile. I mean, no one wants to go into a rented cabin and see evidence that someone else has been there. But hotel rooms are weird that way. So other people have been there. It's just their existence has been scrubbed. And in some ways, it's a morbid joke on Hitchcock's part that you can rent a hotel room, get murdered in the shower, and as long as somebody cleans up, you can rent the room again. And this is kind of a staple of horror movies, is that these haunted houses, these houses that come on the market and they're cheap, because some family got slaughtered there, and then the real estate of God doesn't mention it, and the house looks fine. It's all, the blood's been cleaned up, so to speak, but the house is warped, and this will be huge with the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, which also has multiple rooms of different sorts, and has a cellar, it has a furnace room, it has a maze, and several bathrooms. Bathrooms are the locus of horror, and Hitchcock probably did the most of anyone to make that true with this shower scene. There are at least 4 bathrooms in The Shining. So you could write a paper on the 4 horror movies we're doing. There's a horrific scene in Nightmare on Elm Street where the young girl is in the bathtub, and Freddy Krueger's getting access to her. So the bathroom is the most vulnerable room of the house. It's where, for any number of reasons, you take your clothes off. You're vulnerable. You're in a tub. It's also the most liquid. Literally, it's the liquid center of the house. It's the most changeable part of the house. You have hot water, cold water, steam. The mirror steams up. You wipe the mirror clean. You have pipes. You're much more aware of pipes in a bathroom. You have faucets the water comes out of. You have toilets that flush. And so that, in a way, the bathroom is a lot like the body. It's that things get taken in, things get flushed, things get drained, things get filled up. And Hitchcock takes advantage of that metaphor, the visuality of that metaphor, so that part of what's horrific about the shower scene is it's not just the stabbing, it's the fact that the shower is on, that first the water is going down the drain cleanly before the stabbing, and then it's darkened as we see her blood going down the same drain, and the toilet has already been flushed. But this idea of life draining and life flushed, as opposed to filling up, and there's a crisis of liquidity. I'm going to post my essay on Psycho that I published a little while ago, called "Monsters and Mortgages: The Horror Movie as a Prime Economic Indicator." And my take on this is that the modern monsters, the cinematic monster, really, it's many things. I mean, monsters are concretizations of our anxieties, and the reasons we enjoy horror movies, those of us who do, is that if you concretize your anxiety into a monster, it's terrifying, but now you can kill it. Now you can lock it out, which is why in so many horror movies, of course, you can't seem to keep the monster out. Freddy Krueger enters into real life through people's dreams. So how do you not sleep? That'll become an issue in Elm Street. They're drinking coffee like by the bucketful because they're trying to figure out how Freddy Krueger's doing this before they fall asleep, and he comes out into the real world and murders them. The horror movies are about liminality. I mean, romance tries to shore up the stability of your relationship of self to other, and it even tries to stabilize sexual desire, which is unstable. You can be attracted to quote unquote the wrong people, either because they're not really good for you beyond the sexual attraction, or you're already in a relationship and you probably shouldn't be attracted, but you are. And if you're in love, the idea is you can feel a sexual attraction to someone else in the room, and it's not too big a crisis because you're more interested in looking out for your romantic connection to this person than you are in further indulging a random sexual attraction, which is not cheating. I mean, it's if there's a beautiful, handsome person in the room, it's not cheating to notice. It's not even necessarily cheating to flirt, but it starts to set up a dangerous slope. So then is it cheating to have a sort of kiss in the dark and no more? Yeah, well, that goes a little over the line. Not as much as getting a hotel room, but it's gradations. What if their hand brushes your hand, and it's less about whether hands brush hands and more about how it feels. If the hand brushing warns you that, oh, this is getting a little too intimate, I have a partner, versus this is the excitement that maybe the relationship to the partner is not as short as it might be, and that the brush of a hand against your hand acts as an accelerant to your desire, it still doesn't mean you can't choose to go back with your partner. But as we know, despite romance denying it, that first love, the movies end at the height. It's very hard to imagine any of the couples that we see at the end of these movies cheating on each other. But we're bailing out of the movie at the apex of their achievement of intimacy. And it's a bit of a lie on the part of Hollywood romance that once you achieve that level of intimacy, it becomes some kind of, you put a pin in it and that's it. That's not true at all. Maintaining that level of intimacy is daily work, and you can't always have it at as high a level. And if you don't tend to it at all, it will subside, and then you'll be more vulnerable to attractions in other places. And that's partly because the degree to which the gaze of the other made you feel like you were the desire of the other, that starts to mitigate itself significantly, so that your partner glances at you, and of course you're going to get annoyed no matter how much you love your partner. So, but getting a glance of annoyance from someone is a kind of, it can be almost a gut punch sometimes, especially if it's your lover. And if it's just part of the context of the day, like I'm super tired and you said you'd take out the garbage and you didn't, you can kind of contextualize it. But if it starts to be kind of chronic, where it seems that now whenever your lover looks at you, you don't feel like a desire. You don't feel like you're their desire, that you are the object of their desire. And they don't have to adore you all the time. This is incredibly subtle, and this is all done through the gaze. So no wonder cinema is so adept at playing around with your internalized gaze, your idealized gaze of the people you're with. That can go the other way too, and you could be imagining that the gaze from the other person is way more hostile than it actually is. If you were to ask somebody, why did you just look at me with such a hard look? Sometimes people would say, oh, I'm so sorry. I just took this phone call from my mother and she's being terrible, and it just left me feeling really upset. So it had nothing, you were not in my gaze because my internalized gaze had been activated so glaringly that I was blind. So often if your partner looks at you in a way that doesn't make you feel desired, you might want to ask yourself, what has aggravated their internal gazes to the point where they are blind to their present sight, because the sight turns inward. And then you notice much less, and you're much less present, or as we like to say, emotionally available. So let's push ahead a little bit here. Let's see if I can jump to here. So the movie opens, oddly enough, with this reassuring reporting of clock time. That we're told what day it is, we're told the date, we're told the month, we're told the time. It's 2:43 p.m. None of this is going to matter at all, because horror movies make it clear that clock time is another illusion that we use to stabilize our ego. Like, it's 2:13. I told my friend I'd meet at 3. I'm waiting for Godot, and then Godot doesn't arrive. And part of what's the problem with that is it betrays the illusion of clock time. That the clock time is an imposition of an artificially constructed pattern on an otherwise random chaos. So we like our clock time in a lot of ways, but we sort of, I have my TED talk on this, on the time and the age of anxiety. You can look it up if you want. Just put Gary Leonard TED talk. But the theme of how we become the slave of clock time because we lean on it more and more to stabilize us. And after a while, the clock time is a kind of master internalized gaze. And then we feel like we never have enough time. We're late. We need to do more. And then in capitalism, time becomes money. So you're paid by the hour. You're paid, the factory is paid by how many widgets they can produce in an hour. And so all of a sudden, literally, time is money. Time is money on your cell phone contract. Time's money when you buy a parking ticket. If you outstay the $3 an hour, you can get a ticket for $40, and the fact that you did buy the first hour is null and void. So this is modernity, where everything is monetized. Either you're making money or you're losing money. Either you're accumulating or being deprived. And after a while, that becomes the rhythm of our psyche, and it's not our rhythm anymore. It can be reassuring in the existential crisis of modernity to be controlled by the clock, by the expectations of the boss, by how much money's in your account, and you want to get enough to pay your credit card, and then maybe if you get even more than that, you'd start to have some savings. You'd start to have a buffer against yourself. So this movie is going to open with this bird's eye view of all of Phoenix, and he does a 360-degree pan, which makes us feel godlike. It's really a godlike shot, and there's no plot yet, and it's an exegetic shot. Like, we don't need this shot. We could have opened with being inside the room where Marion Crane and her boyfriend Sam are having a late afternoon sexual tryst, because he lives somewhere in Northern California. He's a plane trip away, and they're having this relationship, and he can't commit to marriage, or he doesn't think he can, because he pays his ex-wife alimony, and he's paying off debts of his dead father, which is a parallel with Norman Bates, of course, except that Norman Bates is has been bankrupted by his mother, and it's a debt he can never pay off. Not just because, I mean, even if it were an actual financial debt, he's not making any money at the Bates Motel. In fact, it's hard to figure out how that works. I mean, presumably he still has to pay land tax or something. So yeah, he inherited the house, I guess, and he inherited the hotel, but I don't know what he's living on. And in a way, Hitchcock gives us the psychological equivalent of that. Like, if you didn't get love growing up and your account is in debit, how do you get that love? And Norman's other big problem is he still wants to believe that his mother loved him. And one of the ways he proves that she loved him is that she hates his girlfriends, or anybody who could be his girlfriend. So when he gives her the dialogue of, tell that woman that she can't, satisfy her disgusting appetite with my food or my son, and she presents the woman actually as a bird, as a predatory bird. And part of Norman would have liked that. When someone's jealous, it can become a problem, but initially it can feel good. Like, if let's say we chat with somebody, and then our partner says, "Who is that?" And it's like, "Oh, what? Oh, sorry. What? Are you jealous?" And they're like, "No, I don't know, maybe." And we're like, "Wow," especially if it's innocent. And in fact, we were not thinking of this other person as a partner at all. But of course, it can go too far. It can go all the way to Stalkerville, where the other person is never satisfied. Their own internalized gaze is so harsh that you can't gaze at them adoringly enough, often enough, for them to offset the chronic erosion of their self-worth that the internalized gaze operates. So watch what happens. In a way, this sight, the godlike sight that opens this movie, will get inflected by desire, because as the camera starts swooping, it's an unmotivated shot. There's no point of view shot. Nobody's seeing this except us. So we're sort of coasting through the air in what feels masterful, but then we keep getting drawn toward this one building. And then we notice there's like 6 windows, but only one of them has the blinds drawn. And then suddenly we're peeping Toms. Like, we think the camera's almost saying, "Okay, I'll do what you want. You notice that window. You want me to go closer to that window. What about now? Yeah, I want you to. I want you to go even closer. Okay. You want to see what's behind these blinds? Yeah, I want to see what's behind these blinds." So we think that we're still controlling the gaze, but in fact, we've gotten trapped by desire, and that becomes clear once we're in the room. And Marion Crane is in her bra and slip, and he doesn't have a shirt on, and they clearly just finished making love, and it's this sort of post-coital both relaxation and but also the emergence of tension. I mean, there's a lot of sexual attraction, and we get that when they're both kissing. But then you see that the sort of, and that's the imaginary order, that they're each everything the other person needs. And this at this point could still be a complicated Hollywood romance. Like, how are they going to work this out? Uh, and because the problems of the relationship keep mounting up, she keeps saying, she said, this is the last time, I don't want to keep doing this. And he's like, well, I can't marry you because I'm living in the hardware store and you'd have to live in the back and you could lick the stamps on the alimony that I send my wife. And she's like, okay, I'll do that. And little like the end of Eternal Sunshine, you know, where they're both like, okay, but he won't do the okay. And you can tell this is a problem for her. And this is going to set up her impulsive decision to take the $40,000 that the wealthy Texan has brought in to buy a house for his daughter. And two reasons she takes the 40,000. The second one is not so obvious. She takes it to try and go to, since the man she loves says, I can't marry you, I have too many debts to pay off. The simple impulse is, here's 40,000. We're just gonna go, we're gonna meet him, we're gonna just leave, or we're gonna get married. And there's something a little unhinged about it. So when Norman Bates says later, we all go a little mad sometimes, haven't you? She says yes, and then says, I have to go back. I have to get out of a trap that I stepped into. And he said, well, I was born into my trap. I guess I don't mind much anymore. And I think he does, on a certain level, he does mind. He's a trapped bird. He's in a cage that his mother helped him construct, and he can't see the way out of it. So Norman wants his mother to be jealous of any woman who takes an interest in him, or in any woman in which he takes an interest. So he's attracted to Marion Crane a little bit. And then he gets his mother to say, you know, she's disgusting and don't give her my food and don't give her yourself. And he defies her, so to speak. He's quote unquote her. And he comes down the steps of the house with a sandwich. He doesn't eat it. He gives it to her, and then he watches her like a bird. Talks about how you eat like a bird and so on. And but let me just do this scene. I could talk about this forever. Watch how our gaze gets increasingly inflected by our desire, how we go from a kind of a sense that the world is in our command. And this is how Hitchcock uses the frame so brilliantly. Is he uses the screen to imply imaginary plenitude in this opening shot. Like, what is there that we can't see? We can see the mountains in the distance. We see 360 degrees. There's nothing we can't see. It's godlike. But that's an illusion. Because, okay, we can see Phoenix, but we can't see New York. I mean, there's always something outside the screen that we're not seeing. And what we can see requires us to not see much more than what we actually see. So there is no screen big enough to contain the world, and there is no self-construction big enough to see all the world. Simmel called this strategy of delimitation. We've got to have a strategy for creating the illusion that what we see is all that needs to be seen. And that's, strictly speaking, never true. So let's watch the camera movement here. There it is. That dissolved into that window, this window right here, and this dark strip here. This is what's outside the imaginary plenitude of the godlike gaze we've been gliding in on. What's in this darkness? This is our desire. And this is the unconscious. This is that part of ourselves that we refuse to be aware of in order to be aware of something else. And so here we are at where the darkness, this is the other thing Hitchcock will do. We've gone from the cityscape of all of Phoenix to 5 inches, maybe 10 inches of a black vertical space. And yet it's the black vertical space that attracts us. It's our lack and our loss that drives our desire. We're always drawn toward lack that corresponds to a lack that we feel, and it drives us forward. But lack is actually, what we lack isn't lack, it's what we feel is lacking. And what we want is not what we want, it's what makes us want. So the lack in us is always looking for a corresponding lack. We don't experience it that way. We think that what we're attracted to will fulfill the lack in us. In fact, it mirrors it, and it just keeps us wanting, which isn't necessarily bad. It's part of being human. So the lack in us is drawn to the lack in the screen. There's one tiny black strip, you know, in this opening vista that we can't see. And so where does our eye go? We head right for this 2 inches of blackness, and just blow past all of Phoenix. Now, you probably could hardly see it. There was just a tiny flicker there. How did this camera get in the room? Well, in fact, Hitchcock had to cut and then start up again with a camera that was at the exact same eye line until you really have to be watching, and you can almost subconsciously, you'll see to a millionth of a second, you'll see a flicker, but it doesn't register as a cut. And of course, this movie is going to be a lot about cutting. The shower scene is going to be a knife cutting a person to death. But it's also a masterpiece of editing, where you cut the film to create the experience of watching a woman being cut to death. And at the same time, as Hitchcock said, I want it to seem as if the knife was ripping the screen. So it isn't just that we're just voyeuristically and safely watching a woman get knifed to death. Some of the shots, there are 71 cuts in 36 seconds. That's incredibly fast. I mean, as far as duration, and the way he snaps back and forth between her view of the mother, it looks like the mother because his dress is, to her horrified gaze at him, to the eyeless, you can't see his face or his eyes. The knife just keeps coming down like the beak of a deranged bird, and sometimes the knife is in fact thrusting at us and in the audience. So it is ripping the fourth wall, and that we temper at certain shots. We are Marion. I mean, the knife is, and when we want to throw up our hands in a self-defensive gesture. Finally, the shot stops. So this has been a tracking shot of 3 minutes with no cuts. That's just kind of astonishing feat in itself, and it took us. And there actually were dissolves. If you watched closely, he had to reset the crane from time to time and to continue the glide toward this window. So, but instead of doing a sharp cut, which you'd notice, he does a dissolve, which is less noticeable, and it doesn't interrupt the apparent glide of the camera. But now finally the camera just stops, and now the people in the shot, their movement takes over. So we're finished now, and we're at the scene of their desire, and he's standing up, obviously, and she's looking up at him, and we can't see. He kind of makes it. You have the horizontal. And you have the vertical. So the axis of desire is presented. So the vertical man who can't commit to marriage because he's in debt, and the horizontal woman who would like to just go with their feelings. She's the one who technically will propose in this scene by finally saying, "Oh, let's just get married," which is kind of emasculating. And this is where gender and gaze is. See, right now we don't even have his gaze yet. We have her looking up at him. So the first part of this makes him look very patriarchal, very masterful. But if you watch the way that Hitchcock cuts this, is he's less and less in control until finally he seems to be smaller than her and seems to have been diminished. And we see him slumped in the corner like a naughty boy, which is a posture that Hitchcock loves to reduce his men to. We'll see Norman Bates go back up into the house and slouch in a kitchen chair like a naughty boy. So Hitchcock almost seems to be saying, all men are naughty boys, full of guilt and desire, who posture as patriarchal, masterful figures.
You never did eat your lunch, did you?
So there's a lot of doubles in this movie. You never did eat your lunch. Well, Norman Bates is going to bring her lunch, which she will eat, but he doesn't. So here's a lunch that she didn't eat, and then later she'll get a lunch offered by Norman where he doesn't eat, which sets up Sam, her boyfriend, as this kind of ideal, theoretically this ideal man, which would allow her to move into a stable marriage. But this is premarital sex, and this is 1960. So, and Hitchcock was raised Catholic, and I'm not saying he's exactly judging this scene, but clearly her internalized gazes, particularly of her mother, who seems also to be dead, and her sister, who's still alive but disapproves of Sam and disapproves of however much she even knows. And I'm going to skip this scene, but notice that when they just start talking about it, and she says, "I don't want to do this anymore," and then she says, "Yeah, you can come to dinner, but my mother's picture on the mantelpiece and with my sister." And he goes, "Okay." And then after dinner, what do? Send your sister to the movie and turn your mother's picture to the wall? And she says, "Sam." Well, that's the whole plot of the movie. Like, what do you do with the mother's gaze, the mother's judgmental gaze? Now, the man he's obviously not a Norman. He seems to be the opposite of Norman Bates, but for toxic masculinity, as we now call it, is partly the result of feeling burdened by your masculinity, that you're in debt all the time. You're never masculine enough. And in capitalism, masculinity is conveyed by accumulation and distribution and the power to control circulation and exchange. And it's bottomless. There's, you get toxic men like Trump who have on this, at least at a glance, would appear to have achieved a lot. I don't even know how much debt he is or isn't in. I'm not sure he does either. But there's no breaks. He's way past. He's into toxic territory. Nothing will ever be enough, no matter how much he gets. And his vindictiveness knows no bounds. And his sense of terror at his own fragility makes him vicious and dangerous to anyone who quote unquote crosses him, and there's no amount of loyalty that will suffice. So Mike Pence can, kiss his butt every day for 4 years, and then just decides to obey the Constitution, and Trump sends in a mob that could have killed him. Okay, so let me move ahead to some other scenes, because namely I do want to at least end on the shower scene. So there's a whole office scene. This is, by the way, this is Hitchcock's daughter, Pat Hitchcock. We have a cameo of Alfred Hitchcock, and he always put cameos in his movies of himself. He never had a speaking role. And if I can find, let me just go forward a little.
Don't miss your plane. Hey, we could leave together, Carmen. I'm late, and you have to put your shoes on.
Okay, so here's Hitchcock. Notice the hat he's wearing, because the rich Texan who's going to come in the door is going to be wearing this hat. So Hitchcock affects a transfer. This is the second part where, in a way, the plot of this movie, like so many Hitchcock movies, it's like a train, and if you turn the tracks a certain way, a train will go to the right or go to the left, or it'll go straight. And Hitchcock tends to treat plot that way. And so this is another point where the plot's going to get derailed. And in the same way that our gaze got a little bit derailed, or just got, jumped into the window, and now that's, we seem to have gathered speed again, and we know what's going on. He has to go back to work. It's late in the afternoon, but the plot's about to dislocate again. There she comes, right past her director.
Is Mr. Lowry back from lunch? He's lunching with a man who's...
Okay, and now we can jump to the Texan who's wearing Hitchcock's hat, and so again, there's notice this desert. and over here is actually I think there's a small town. So Hitchcock was British, and he came over, was a grocer's son, and he came over after several successful movies made in England. He was brought up by Hollywood, and he came over here, and his first big movie was with Cell Studios, Rebecca, and he fought with studios every day after that to introduce his own vision. Now, by 1960, he was one of the most famous directors in the world. He had a television show that was incredibly popular called The Alfred Hitchcock Show. And he paid for this. He paid for Psycho himself. The studios wanted nothing to do with it. It was just beyond crazy. So he paid for it himself, and he shot it on the same lot in many cases, as much as he could, as he was making his TV show. And he he didn't tell the studios. So he made this for like something like, I don't know, $30,000-$40,000, which is, you know, pretty much nothing. And the millions and millions this movie made when it came out, but it's almost shot like a TV show, and that's one of the reasons it's in black and white. But Hitchcock worked in black and white the first 30 years of his career. He had to learn what to do with color, so it's no big deal. He knows what black and white can do that color can't. But this is America is, you know, built on nothing, and Hitchcock would have been aware of that. Hollywood is built on nothing. Hollywood's a desert. It has to be irrigated. It's why it has no water now. It's why it's burning down all the time. It's artificial. And just like the Overlook was plopped onto an Indian burial ground, as though there's no security. America has no footing. That's why our documents are so hyper idealistic, because America has been written into existence. There is no America other than what our documents insist. And I keep saying our because I was raised in the States, and up until I came here in 1990 to teach you guys. Of course, you were even born in 1990, but you know, ever since I came here in 1990, I've been teaching 21-year-olds. So I assume that I'm still 31 by that logic. You guys don't grow up, so why should I? Anyway. Or you guys keep me young. You know, it's not a little less insane. So here this guy's just sort of holding forth, and he's going to start flirting with Marion Crane. Now, what's kind of a little gross about his flirting is he's there to buy his daughter a house as a wedding present, and there's a kind of Ivanka Donald Trump vibe here that he seems to be talking about his desire for his daughter by talking about his desire for her, for Marion Crane. I mean, he's basically flirting with her, and it's kind of making it clear that if she were to invite him to ask her out to dinner, he certainly would do that, and there would be plenty of money around, and they would have some kind of one-night stand, and so, but it's all a little it's extra unsavory because he's literally there talking about his daughter. I mean, it might be a little unsavory to have an older man like this hitting on a pretty secretary, especially when he foregrounds everything with his money, so that he's practically treating her like a prostitute.
Boss, to air condition you up. You can afford it today.
Marion, will you get the copies of that deed ready for Mr. Cassidy?
Tomorrow's the day, my sweet little girl. Oh, not you. My daughter.
Yeah, so did you see her startled glance? My sweet little girl. And she's like, seriously? Did you just call me your sweet little girl? And he's like, oh, no, not you. But then he goes over and proceeds to treat her as though you could be my sweet little girl. And Pat Hitchcock has a funny line about how, he didn't pay any attention to me. He must have noticed my wedding ring.
A baby.
And now look at the mise-en-scène here. Look at the gaze work. She's staring at this contract. She's not making eye contact with him. He's trying to get her to make eye contact. He's sitting on her desk. He's perched above her. There's a lot of bird imagery here of the bird of prey looking down at the mouse, or the owl looking at the mouse, the hawk. But at other times, the bird is the one that seems caged and helpless, depending on which kind of bird. So birds work both ends of the spectrum for Hitchcock. They can be trapped and helpless, and they can be predatory and merciless.
And tomorrow she stands her sweet self up there and gets married away from me.
So her sweet self gets married away from me. I want you to take a look at my baby. It's a little cringy.
I want you to take a look at my baby. 18 years old, and she never had a...
So at this point, the real estate director is kind of like, oh God, how long does this? I really want to just get this contract done. But I cut off his flirting with my secretary. It's obvious she's also putting up with it. Can't irritate this guy because it's bad business.
An unhappy day in any one of those years.
She never, well, according to him.
Come on, Tom. My office is air conditioned.
So that's quite a predatory look. And notice what makes it look so predatory is that he's being spoken to, and he's not averting his gaze from her at all. He's always completely ignoring the real estate agent. So this is an important example of how master gazes can show how they're inflected by desire. He wants her. He doesn't want whatever this agent is talking about.
You know what I do about happiness? I buy it off. Are you unhappy?
Yeah. Okay. So that's pretty blunt. And he's doing this in the office, right in front of the other secretary and the real estate agent.
Not inordinately.
I'm buying this house for my baby's wedding present. $40,000 cash. Now that's not buying happiness. That's just buying off unhappiness. I never carry more than I can afford to lose.
Well, that's good because he's gonna lose it. And I think this is the other impulse why she takes the money is she is so sick of guys like him thinking that they can just hit on her because they have a lot of money, and that she somehow has to be their object of desire because he can afford to pay for them.
I declare.
I don't. That's how I get to keep it.
Tom, cash transaction of this size is most irregular.
Now, so what? It's my private money. Now it's yours.
Suppose we put it in the safe, and then Monday morning when you're feeling good.
Oh, speaking of feeling good, where's that bottle you said was in your desk? Sometimes I can't keep my mouth shut.
So there's another direct invitation to her. Do you want me to take you out on the town and be your sugar daddy? The sugar daddy, sugar baby thing that we seem to hear a lot about these days. I'm waiting for a Hollywood romance about that because it's a somewhat new phenomenon, which is something. It's not prostitution, it's not dating, it's something, but it could go either way. It's another sort of liminal transactional state where you essentially pay for the attention of what's called the girlfriend experience, which is a fascinating phrase because the girlfriend experience for the man is there's a guarantee that it'll be the best part of girlfriend experiences. Like you're paying, and not necessarily for sex, you're paying for the best of the girlfriend experience, which is having fun, having them be interested, having them listen, and not the other part, which is like, why don't you shut up? What's wrong with you? I have a headache, go home. Which is also part of the girlfriend experience. Well, no, that's part of being in a relationship with someone else. But modernity does that. It winds up saying, what do you like most about having a girlfriend? Good. Well, we'll just do that. We'll take out the sugar, we'll take out the fat, we'll take out the salt, we'll take out everything bad so you can enjoy yourself. There's a commandment to enjoy in modernity that can very often feel like a burden, like I'm not enjoying myself enough. When I was a kid, I used to see that gum commercial for double mint gum. I don't even know if there is double mint gum anymore, but the slogan was double your pleasure, double your fun with double mint gum. And I was like 6 years old, and I'm sitting there and thinking, do I have to, oh my God, how am I going to double my pleasure? I'm not even enjoying myself very much now. So the burden of enjoyment being thrust upon you, you know, have a Coke, have it your way. We do it all for you. It's a weird obligation. Enjoyment, the commandment to enjoy in postmodernism has replaced the commandment to obey. We are commanded to obey by enjoying. So in the end, it's the same thing, except that we're persuaded that this is being done for us. But we do it all for you. No, I'm sorry, but Burger King doesn't do it all for you, if that's even their slogan. Or we cost a little more, but you're worth it, according to Revlon. How the hell do they know what you were? This is an excuse to charge you twice as much for your lipstick. Okay, because I need to wind this up, so I'm gonna go to the shower scene, and I'm gonna walk through something that I talk about in the essay that I'm gonna post, along with this this lecture. Let's see. There's a part I want to get to. There's a beautiful shot of this swooping owl, and this picture, which is based on the rape of the Sabine women, which was a popular, and this also looks like a bit of a rape scene. This is a classic rape scene that was painted over and over by men, not least of all because they were fascinated with the topic. I mean, you could draw lots of half-naked women running away from men who were chasing them and say, "Oh, this is just a classic Greek scene." But then the male viewers at the art galleries would be able to look at these scenes. But behind the scene is a hole in the wallboard that looks into the cabin that he's going to give her, cabin number one. We don't know that at this point, but at this point, this gaze and this gaze will be combined. The only way Norman Bates has the master gaze is when he's peeping. And when he can't be seen, because his internalized gaze is so harsh, he has to be in the dark. But when him peeping through this hole gets aligned by Hitchcock with us sitting in the dark watching this film, we're also peering through a keyhole. And the way he makes that clear is just when he shows us the hole, he shows us Marion walking back and forth in her bathrobe. He shows us Norman looking again, and then he insists on shooting it from the side so we can see the light entering Norman Bates's eyes. And this is the scene where she's taken off her bathrobe, and so we watch him watch her naked, but we don't see her naked. And it's kind of a gotcha on Hitchcock's part of, you want to look through this hole too, don't you? You're a peeping Tom. You can judge Norman, but he's not. He's on the same continuum as human desire, however warped and perverted or psychotic it may have become. Let's see, let me just jump a little bit here. Okay, so here's the side shot where, right, she's now taking off her bathrobe over here somewhere, but this looks like a camera projector going right into his eye. And this is us in the audience, and this is the camera projector. And this black strip is again that space in between our projections of reality and our subjective experience. Okay, I went too far. So after he's peeped at her, this is the scene where he walks down the hall. The staircase is very looming, but the staircase is what he needs to climb to grow up. And we watch him just before the scene, and he puts his foot on the first step, and he's going to go upstairs to defy his mother, who's been dead 10 years, and then he can't, and he goes way back and sits in the kitchen like a naughty, scared boy. But that's not the scene I want to end with. So here we get it. Notice this brilliant use of the static shot. Hitchcock has a very mobile camera, but it's frozen. It can't follow. It doesn't follow Norman Bates because it wants us to experience him cornering himself, going back into his cage. Like the cage door is open. His mother's been dead 10 years, but he can't imagine anything beyond the cage. So he just keeps quietly going back to the cage, even though the door's not shut anymore. And you can see the way he's hunched over. Now he looks like a vulnerable, wounded bird. Now, from there, we segue to her. Now, she's also sitting down, also in a somewhat crouched posture, but she's not as trapped as him yet. And in fact, what she's doing is she's trying to balance out how much she owes of the 40,000, having paid the expenses of switching the car and probably a little bit here and there for food and for lodging, so she can pay it back. So she's trying to balance her checkbook. And this is going to be the prelude to her unexpectedly, by both the audience and her, and even Norman Bates, to being killed in the shower. And notice how the way that Hitchcock infuses this scene with horror is this is not very diegetic. Like, we don't really need to see her balancing her checkbook before she gets in the shower. And also, this is a good time to mention that more than 30 minutes of Psycho is silent. Hitchcock learned his technique in the silent era. His first 3 movies were silent, and he worked on dozens of silent movies in the early 20s. So he learned his craft with black and white. He learned it with silent. And to Hitchcock, he learned how to use sound. I mean, the sound in this is brilliant. But he never made that mistake of thinking that sound was better than silent. Sound is just something else. So there's much more silence in Hitchcock's movies than other movies of that era. He'll just let his camera roam around for minutes on end with no dialogue, sometimes soundtrack, sometimes not. Originally, he filmed the shower scene we're about to see with no soundtrack, just the sound of the water, and that would be pretty horrific. But it's even more augmented by the soundtrack. So he's going to actually go so far as to go in and let us see the zeros that she's drawn. And this is where Hitchcock switches into an avant-garde technique. If suddenly the camera what's motivating the camera is shape. It's now going to be obsessed with circles. So it goes from the circles of the zeros on her checkbook. Then we'll see the perfect circle of her mouth screaming. We'll see the circle of the drain that the water's going down. We'll see the circle of the toilet where she's throwing out the ripped up counting. She doesn't want that to be found later. And finally, the circle of her blood going down the drain will dissolve into the circle of her wide staring dead eye. And so that zero is the void that is always there. And in Hitchcock, you're never more vulnerable to the void than when you think you've escaped it. So she's going to get out of her trap, and she doesn't realize that she's already positioned herself in Norman Bates's trap. And in a weird way, there's nothing personal about this murder as far as Norman's attitude to her. What's happened is he's felt sexual desire for her, and in his desperate attempt to be the object of his mother's desire, it's now important that his mother have a homicidal rage at this woman who evoked desire in her son. And so he'll dress up as her and kill Marion to try and show Norman, little boy Norman, which is the last time we saw him, that he's loved so much that the mother will kill any woman who comes between them. And notice there's a weird echo here that the incestuous implications of Norman Bates and his mother is mirrored with that guy we saw in the real estate office in the harsh glare of daylight. So it's not like incest or the incestual impulse is also just something that happens to psychotic people in the dark. It's everywhere in our culture. Pedophilia is obviously, it's illegal, it's immoral, but it's everywhere. The whole Lolita culture that we have, sexualizing women at a younger and younger age, and we can call it perversion, but what does it mean when perversion is everywhere in the mainstream? How many ads make women look like little girls, or if not little girls, certainly daughters, and there's implied incest in perfume and cologne ads, and sometimes it's explicit if you go back to the 60s and 70s, and now we think it's not explicit, but that's just because we've rearranged the coding. Okay, so we'll come up to the zero here. There it is. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. A lot of zeros. And now bear that, all those zeros in mind, because you're going to see them again: the toilet, the drain, the eye, the mouth, the shower head. This camera it becomes obsessed with zeros. And the reason this isn't entirely a diegetic shot is like, what did she have to do all that figuring for? She spent $700 on the car. So she writes down 40,000 minus 700 is 39,300. You can't do that in your head. I mean, and then she rips it up. It's almost it is almost avant-garde. It's surrealist. Like, it doesn't entirely make any sense. It's almost like a different kind of dream logic has taken over. Before we even know it. I mean, the gaze of the cameras become obsessive and perverse. So she was about to put it in the trash can, but a trash can doesn't flush. So it's clear that she's trying to take away all the stain of her crime, so she doesn't want to leave this. And I don't think it's about, I mean, who cares? She's going back to admit that she took it. Why is she so anxious to throw out this ripped up thing? And by the way, this ripping that she just did is a preamble to the ripping that the knife is going to do in the shower scene. So that's what I mean by there's a surreal logic now. Like she's reenacting what's about to be her murder by the way she rips up the piece of paper, and the way she seems to think she can get rid of inconvenient desire by flushing it. There's the next zero. And this is, by the way, the first time in Hollywood film that a toilet will be flushed on screen. It's pretty much the first time there's been a toilet at all. So Hitchcock's drawing attention to all those things movies usually leave out, which is that people use bathrooms. And when Norman Bates shows her the room, he goes, "There's the and he can't say the word. He can't say the word bathroom. So there's denial of bodily function, whether it's sexual arousal or going to the bathroom. Is, we have all these modern appliances that whoosh it away and flush it away and swish it away. And this was very clear in the ads of the 60s, and maybe still is, like, paper towels that mop up whatever needs to be mopped up, 10 different kinds of soap for every possible description of whether it's shampoo or dishwasher. Nothing's ever clean enough. If you watch these obsessive ads like Mr. Clean, who the hell is Mr. Clean? And how is it that a housewife can look up and there's an 8-foot tall, bald white guy and she's like, "Hi"? I mean, that's crazy. So that extra glance at the door, and notice this is ambient sound, so we hear the gulp of the toilet. And we've already, this whole issue of like a voracious appetite and gulping has been a bit of a theme. Like, you eat like a bird, and the mother saying, "No, you can't have my food, and you can't have my son." Now the other, obviously there is nothing that quite qualifies as nudity in this scene. So we really won't see breasts or the lower area, but we'll see up to mid thigh. We'll see from the head and the neck, and we'll even see the torso, the belly button and the mid torso, but the so-called erogenous zones will be left out of the editing. But it's part of that imaginary plenitude that in some ways Hitchcock is able to make her seem more naked than if he had just, like nowadays, if you were to do a movie like this, you wouldn't be cutting like that. This naked woman would get in the shower, but it would be less erotic in a strange way, because there'd be nothing that you had to imagine. And by showing us everything except the most sexualized parts of a woman, Hitchcock creates a very sexualized sensation that we're looking at a naked woman, and she seems almost more naked than if Hitchcock just shot her naked. And there's also the vicariousness that we know the water is flowing down her entire body, and we see her enjoying the sensation. So this is, and yet the body, the again, these erogenous zones are off screen, but they're also on screen in the expression. I mean, she's not having a sexual moment here. She's having a sensual moment. She's enjoying the feeling of the shower on her body. That's a very strange shot, but notice that it still is another O, and there's an O, and the water's coming out. And if you look closely, the water's not just coming out. There's a larger shower head that it's outside the camera because Hitchcock he wanted the water flow to be wider than this little shower head could perform. So there's the enjoyment. And so here's a shot of the shower from the side, and notice this mimics the way he shot the Peeping Tom scene. That first were shown with the hole straight on. So that was the first zero. The first hole was the Peeping Tom hole, and again we're going to the side here, which in a way is menacing. Although you don't really realize this until after the scene is over, that this is a Norman Bates. This is a Norman Bates shot. Like we're moving away. We're moving out of the Norman Bates shot, sorry, which means that now Norman Bates can appear. And also that now that we're also shooting from, essentially from the point of view of a tile wall, which is of course impossible, the shower curtain looks like a movie screen. And she seems to be on this side of the movie screen, like in between the screen and us, like in that space between us and the screen. That strip of black, which this movie is obsessed with, and all horror movies essentially give over the entire screen to the strip of black, and then somehow they have to fight the monsters or whatever to get that strip of black to recede into an almost unnoticeable detail in the corner, and that's the basic cinematic rhythm of horror, where the black strip is barely noticeable, and there is nothing but blackness. The screen is huge. It doesn't even look like how can a shower curtain be so wide? And it really does look like she's stepped out of the screen, and she's no longer on the movie screen. But and now we see that the movie is going to grab her and pull her back in. She's going to be, and in fact the screen will be ripped, but she'll also have died. And there's kind of an implication that we need to maintain that gap, that black strip. That's part of being not psychotic and not dead. And she doesn't know this, but and this happens in horror, she's wandered into the liminal space between fate and desire. And in this moment, because of the shot tracking forward, she's not on screen at all anymore. And it's dominated. This is Norman Bates, oddly enough, dressing up as his mother to achieve the master gaze. This reaching out is also, he appears to be breaking the fourth wall. She's reaching out to us, and we're horrified because we would, of course, want to give her aid. That final grasp of this movie screen curtain, and the screen rips. And now comes the zero of the drain, her blood, and the dissolve of the drain into the zero of her dead eye. And at this point, the camera needs to go somewhere else because she's dead. There's no subjectivity. There's nothing in the scene that's alive. And the camera, it seems like the camera can't stand that. So after it's pulled out from this shot, in this amazing backwards dolly shot, which it takes quite a few takes because it's not easy to keep your eye open as long as this continual shot. And that's what Hitchcock wanted. He wasn't going to cut. And so now the camera wanders and looks for something to get itself back into the symbolic order. So it comes to the newspaper, which has the money in it. But the money is completely a red herring at this point. Like, we thought this was a movie about taking $40,000. The money's just paper, and it's in a newspaper. And there's no difference between the paper that's the money and the paper that's the newspaper. And after Norman Bates has cleaned up this crime, and he's cleaning up his mother's crime, he doesn't think he did it. He thinks she did it. And he's horrified, but there's also another part of him that's pleased that his mother loves him so much she kills women that he finds attractive. But in a final detail, he nearly leaves the newspaper and he just happens to notice it, and he tosses $40,000 into the trunk, and that will go into the swamp. And the money will continue to motivate the people who are looking for her. The insurance company hires a detective. They all want this money back, this paper, and the movie's done with it. It's like the money it isn't anything. It's just a sort of symbolic consensus of a value that is that's entirely relative and doesn't actually adhere anywhere to anything, even though this whole movie has been dominated by money. You even have okay, which is anything but okay. And now we're going to go out the window because he's gone back. He's gone back and now has slipped back into being Norman, and sees the blood on his mother's clothes and says, "Mother, oh God, mother, no, blood, no." And now he's horrified. He thinks he knows what his mother did. And of course, on some level, he has to know because he's the one who did it. Now we'll see him run down the steps again. And we go from the vertical to the horizontal. And then notice the camera, there's no shot counter shot here, where all we see is the back of his head. And this is Hitchcock's knowing that we know what he's seeing, but we don't see it. And in a way, that way we see it more because we're seeing it inflected through the horror of his split personality. And then the picture of the bird falls off the wall. There's one bird that falls off the wall, and there's one bird that's still on the wall. And remember that early scene, what do we do with your mother's picture? Do we turn it back to the wall? But you can't take an internalized gaze and turn it back to the wall. All right, I'm going to stop here. And this damn thing, this lecture better be taped. I think this probably was a little better than the one, this lecture was a little better than the one that didn't get taped. But we'll never know. And in any event, I don't want to succumb to the myth of perfection here. I think the lecture is good enough for now. And I'm going to switch back to here, and I'm going to stop sharing. So here I am. Night has fallen while I gave this lecture. So now you're seeing me by by the light of a table lamp. So there's something appropriate about that. I seem to be grainier than when we first said hello. So, okay, so I think I'm done. I stopped sharing. I'm going to turn off the camera. Okay, so where did that go? Stop recording.